If you love tales of grit, redemption, and the kind of frontier stories that twist your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below about your favorite Wild West legend. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now saddle up, because this story begins with a man who swore never to care again, until the desert forced him to break that vow. The plain stretched wide and unforgiving, a sea of dust and thornbush under a sun that punished every living thing daring to cross its path. A lone rider moved through it, hat pulled low, rifle slung across his saddle, eyes that never lingered long on any horizon. He was known to no one and wanted it that way. In the towns he sometimes drifted through, men called him stranger, and he never corrected them. He had once had a name that meant something, but that belonged to another life, one buried under gun smoke and blood. His horse's hooves struck the dirt rhythmically, a lonely heartbeat in a land where silence was more common than voices. He avoided people not because he hated them but because he no longer trusted what company could bring. Promises had failed him before. Brotherhood had shattered in betrayal. The trail offered no comfort, but at least it didn't lie. The cowboy thought the day would pass as most did, riding until dark, stopping only to sip stale water and gnaw on dried meat. But fate had other ideas. A vulture wheeled low overhead, its circles pulling his gaze to a cluster of rocks off the trail. Something lay there, unmoving. He pulled the reins, suspicion tightening in his gut. Bandits often left bait in the open, waiting for fools to ride closer. He studied the scene carefully, noting the absence of hoofprints, the silence of waiting ambush. Against his better judgment, he rode closer. The figure was a girl, young, blood staining the earth beneath her. Her skin was darkened by sun, her braids tangled with dust. A leather fringe clung to her shoulders, torn and soaked through. She breathed shallowly, each rise and fall weaker than the last. The cowboy muttered a curse. He had no business here. Saving her would slow him down, tie him to troubles not his own. He dismounted anyway. Kneeling, he pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A faint pulse answered. She wasn't gone yet. He looked around again, uneasy, before lifting her into his arms. She was light, too light, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. He carried her to a shaded overhang, set her down gently, and reached for his canteen. Her lips parted when the water touched them, her eyes fluttering open, revealing dark irises full of pain but not fear. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. "Quiet," he said, his voice a low drawl hardened by years of disuse. "Drink first." She obeyed, sipping enough to wet her throat. When she leaned back, her gaze fixed on him with something that unsettled him. Gratitude. Trust. Things he didn't deserve. He tore strips from a spare shirt and pressed them to the wound at her side. It was a cruel gash, the kind a knife left behind. Bandits, he thought. Or worse. He poured whiskey on it despite her flinch, holding her steady with a gentleness that surprised even him. The sun slipped lower as he worked, the shadows stretching long. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words in her tongue that he couldn't understand. He kept her alive through stubborn effort, refusing to let death claim her while his hand still moved. Night found them beside a small fire he dared to light, the flames hidden behind rocks. He sat with his rifle across his knees, every sense alert. She stirred again, eyes clearer this time. "Stranger," she whispered, her voice like wind through dry grass. He blinked. "What?" "You are a stranger," she said more firmly, then coughed weakly. "That's as good a name as any," he replied, though the sound of it unsettled him. Names bound men to things. He had long tried to stay unbound. She studied him, then closed her eyes, trusting enough to rest again. The cowboy stared into the fire, the crackle of wood masking the thoughts he didn't want to face. He had spent years convincing himself he needed no one, that solitude was the only way to survive in a world that always took more than it gave. Yet tonight, with a half-dead girl breathing softly beside him, the silence felt less suffocating. It felt different. When the stars crowded the sky, cold crept in. He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, muttering that it was only so she wouldn't die before morning. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had made a choice when he picked her up off the dirt, and choices had consequences. The fire flickered, painting shadows across his withered face. For the first time in years, he felt the fragile weight of responsibility settle on him again, not the kind born from debts or violence, but something quieter. Something dangerous in its own way. By dawn, he would need to decide whether to ride on alone or carry her with him. But as the night deepened and her breathing steadied under his watch, he realized the decision was already made. The cowboy, who had once sworn never to care again, found himself tethered to a dying girl's fragile will to live. And though he could not yet admit it, he already knew this was the start of a trail he could never turn back from. The morning broke pale and brittle, frost dusting the sagebrush and hardening the soil. The cowboy stirred the fire back to life, careful not to wake the girl. She had survived the night, her breath steadier now, her skin less ashen. Relief surprised him, though he refused to name it as such. He told himself he simply hated burying bodies. That lie held about as well as a rotted saddle strap. When she woke, hunger sharpened her gaze. He handed her the last of his jerky, watching as she chewed slowly, each bite measured like a sacred act. She whispered something in her tongue, a blessing perhaps, and then gave him a small nod. He realized it had been years since anyone had thanked him without hidden motive. The gesture carried more weight than words. They traveled together by noon, her slung carefully across his horse until she could stand on her own. At first she leaned heavily on him, each step uncertain, but her determination burned brighter than her weakness. By the third day, she was walking beside him, refusing to be carried further. Stubbornness recognized stubbornness, he almost smiled. She proved quick to adapt, finding water in places he would have passed by, pointing out roots and herbs that eased his fatigue. He noticed how her eyes read the land differently than his, how her silence carried meaning where his was empty. He taught her the revolver, her hands trembling at first before steadying with surprising precision. Together, they carved a fragile rhythm out of the wilderness. One evening, as the fire cracked low, she asked him about his scars. He deflected, as he always did, but she held his gaze until words spilled he hadn't meant to release. He told her of a war fought between men who looked the same but believed different things, of blood spilled until loyalty soured into betrayal. He told her how trust had been burned out of him, leaving only the husk that wandered now. He expected pity or fear, but she offered neither. Instead, she said softly, "The earth gives second chances to all who walk it. Even you." Her words struck like a bullet but healed like balm. For the first time in years, he wondered if redemption wasn't a fool's dream. He found himself watching her more often, how she moved with purpose despite her injuries, how her laughter cracked the silence like sunlight through storm clouds. Something dangerous stirred in him, not lust but warmth. A warmth he thought the world had stolen forever. That fragile peace shattered when the raiders returned. He saw the signs first, hoofprints too fresh, smoke on the horizon not made by travelers. He knew the kind of men who left wounds like hers, and they had come back to finish what they started. He tightened the strap on his revolver and told her to keep close. Her chin lifted in defiance, as though she would not be helpless again. They struck near dusk, emerging from the canyon shadows like wolves, rifles glinting in the dying light. 5 riders, cruel-faced, the kind who saw mercy as weakness. The cowboy shoved the girl behind the rocks, his revolver barking before the leader could even raise his gun. One fell, then another, dust exploding around their boots as lead sang through the air. The girl did not cower. She took the spare revolver he had pressed into her hands days before and fired with trembling resolve. Her shot clipped a rider's arm, sending him spiraling from the saddle. Rage turned their charge chaotic, and in that chaos, the cowboy became what he once had been, precise, unrelenting, a storm of violence honed by years of war. But even storms take wounds. A bullet tore into his side, fire searing through his ribs. He staggered but did not fall, forcing his body to keep moving. 3 raiders lay dead, one crippled, but the last lunged forward, knife flashing in the twilight. The cowboy raised his revolver too slow, blood soaking his shirt. Before the blade could strike, the girl darted forward, seizing a burning branch from the fire and driving it into the attacker's face. he screamed, stumbling back long enough for the cowboy's final shot to drop him cold. Silence followed, thick and raw. The cowboy swayed, blood dripping into the dirt, and she caught him with arms too small for his weight but fierce enough to hold. Her face, smudged with ash and determination, hovered over his. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now I save you." He wanted to argue, to claim he needed no one, but the words died in his throat. She pressed cloth against his wound, her hand steady even as her eyes filled with fear. Together, they dragged themselves back to the firelight, two survivors bound now by more than chance. Pain blurred his vision, yet through it he saw her clearly. She was no longer just the wounded girl he had lifted from the dirt. She was a force that refused to yield, a fire that had burned its way into the hollow space inside him. He realized then, as she whispered reassurances in a language he barely understood, that he was not alone. He had not been since the moment he chose to lift her. The night stretched long as she fought to keep him alive, just as he had done for her. When dawn finally broke, painting the desert in gold, the cowboy opened his eyes to find her still watching over him, her hand resting firmly on his chest as if daring death to try again. He drew a breath that hurt like hell but felt sweeter than any he could remember. Looking at her, fierce and unyielding, he spoke words he had never thought he would say, "Maybe you're the only warmth I ever needed." Her answering smile was weary but radiant, carrying with it the promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine. The cowboy, once condemned to walk the frontier alone, now found his trail forever tied to hers. And as the sun climbed higher, driving shadows from the land, the two of them sat together by the fading fire, no longer strangers but something far greater.